Welcome to the Digital Signage Today podcast, produced by Networld Media Group. I'm Judy Mottl, editor of digitalsignagetoday.com. I'm really excited. This is my first DST podcast, and I have a tremendous guest. So I want to welcome everyone to meet Ricardo Belmar, who has a 2 or 3 decades career in retail tech and digital transformation. He is the Director Partner Marketing for Retail and Consumer Goods at Microsoft. In his role, he helps Microsoft Cloud for Retail partners grow their business. And he's all about delivering cloud-based AI solutions and services and solving business challenges, whether it's in the supply chain, store operation, or elevating the shopper journey. He has over 2 decades of experience leading retail tech marketing and product teams. And it's all about optimizing operations and elevating customer experiences. And Ricardo is also the podcast producer and host of the Retail Razor Podcast Network series. And this is a tremendous podcast, so I recommend everybody watch it and listen because it's all about helping retailers cut through the clutter in retail trends and retail tech. So welcome and thanks for being here, Ricardo.
Oh, thank you, Judy. It's a pleasure to be here.
I was thinking back, when I first met you at NRF and maybe, I don't know, it might even be 8, 9 years ago. And,
Yeah, something like that.
I was just so amazed by your expertise and your view on what was happening in tech. And so I'm so privileged to have you here. I want to kick off talking about digital signage, as is one of the few topics I haven't really written about in 20, 30 years of tech reporting. And I'm trying to get a handle on where digital signage stands today as a retail technology. And given your background, can you start us where it started and kind of what prompted the evolution?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to me. Digital signage is one of these technologies in retail that has evolved a lot, I think, since the beginning days. In the beginning, digital signage was, I think, literally what the name implies. You had a screen that you put it somewhere in a store and you try to put content on it.
Right.
And I think most retailers originally thought of it as, I'll probably put some content on there that is, aiding promotions I already have going on in the store. So maybe hang it over a display over an end or on an end cap, and let's put some content on it that helps promote and describe those products, which sounds great, right? And a number of retailers did it. I think what most retailers found in the early days is that, you had technology folks in IT putting digital signage in, and I think they quickly realized that, they're not content people. IT is not used to managing content. That's more of a marketing function. And I know I worked with a few retailers who kind of had to push through that challenge where either IT got maybe a little bit ahead of the business on that, which is usually a good thing, right? Usually it's great when your technology team is driving the business forward with technology. But digital signage was one of those things where if the rest of the organization wasn't ready for it, ultimately what ends up happening is you get dark screens in the stores. And of course, as a consumer, right, you walk into a store, there's probably only one thing that I think is worse than seeing a dark screen, and that's like, in my mind, it's a store that tells you they have guest Wi-Fi and the Wi-Fi doesn't work.
Right.
But those are probably the 2 technology things that, for any store, are the worst things that can happen from a consumer's point of view, because it just looks like the environment doesn't work. Right. And so it's really off-putting to shop in that environment. So I think those are some of the early challenges, and of course, and it was expensive too. That was the other thing I think that held retailers back, because not only did you have to hang screens, there was a lot of challenges in the installation. I think, as most people who work in stores realize, that even if you're a retailer with 200 stores, there are probably 190 differences across those stores physically, right, in the environments, because as much as you try to make them potentially a cookie cutter experience, there are always going to be nuanced differences. The shape of the store itself, right, and whatever location you're at might vary. So that gives you installation challenges. The cost was a challenge, and the screens themselves, unfortunately, in these early days, they also broke down.
Right.
And so you had to have a way to manage the process of maintenance
right.
of that, and that was another challenge. So now the good news in those days, there were companies. I worked for one of them at the time that offered that as a service to help with the management piece of it,
Right.
as well as the content management. But what I think the number one challenge that wasn't overcome is, what do you put on the screen?
Oh,
Um, and in those early days, I remember talking to retailers, and our teams would tell them, work with your marketing team. Whatever you're selling, work with those brands. The brands have content.
right.
Whether you're doing a promotion, maybe you could turn this into a revenue generating business. And
Right.
so, as I describe this now, of course, today we would all just say, well, of course, that's a retail media network.
Right.
But in the early days, maybe if we had all called it that, it would have worked out a little bit faster. But we just told people it's digital signage, and here's what you can do with it.
Right.
And I think we spent more time talking to IT folks at retailers to try to pitch that. And we should have spent more time talking to marketing people.
Well, you know why? Because I think, and it's one of the things I think you and I first talked about when we met, the whole back end, the whole network,
Mm-hmm.
that's such a strong part of it. You
Yeah.
can have content, but if your network fails, and like you said,
Right.
every store has a different network, and every store,
Yeah.
has a different failover. So, and somebody coming into a store and they expect to see the signage kind of giving them that week's sales or whatever, and it's not there, they're not going to look for it again.
Yeah.
And way back, part of the issue was that the digital signage piece was kind of like e-ink. It was like
Yeah.
digital
Yeah.
paper,
Right. Right.
and like you said, I don't think it was that nobody wanted ownership. It was just
Mhm.
kind of hard to figure out where it fell. And
Yeah. Yeah.
where does it fall today, primarily, in terms of who's directing
Mhm.
that digital signage strategy and kind of the content piece?
Yeah. I think today there's acknowledgement that this really is part of a retail media network solution overall.
Right.
And I think the retailers who are successful at delivering and creating the retail media network, they'll have a dedicated team that likely grows out of the marketing org. I think maybe a smaller retailer may keep that under the, it'll be under the CMO, and it may be some of the existing marketing team. I think other retailers are also recognizing that you really have to act like a media company,
Right.
with respect to brands, right, to operate your media network. So you need a dedicated team of people that come from the media industry and the ad industry rather than from retail, and maybe get added on to the retail business in that sense to really manage that interface. And that kind of detaches you from the technology piece.
Right.
So you still need the IT team, right, to help you with the technology piece. But I think it's not owned by IT anymore. I think originally you really had IT shops that were owning the digital signage.
Right.
I think now ownership, because it's part of the retail media network, it sits with those media roles and ad roles, and it's supported by IT, where IT is doing what I would consider the traditional IT job with technology, which means supporting it to make sure that it's always working. They're managing the maintenance of it. They're making sure it's always operating correctly and doing what the business wants it to do.
Right. And I think there's been deeper growth in terms of bringing in partners
Mm-hmm.
To handle it as well. I mean, you have your internal IT team, but when you have somebody who really can put that installation up,
Right.
in 3 weeks rather than 6 months, and kind of be the person you go to, I think that helps. And the fact that
Mm-hmm.
the prices dropped has made
Yeah, that makes a
having a
difference.
management partner, more
Mm-hmm.
accessible, right?
Right. Yeah, that's definitely a big part of it. You look at the cost of just the screen elements today versus 10 years ago. Man, it's huge, dramatic differences. And along with that too, the technology itself, I think, evolved. That when we talked about screens at the beginning, everyone had in their mind the HD TV set they had at home,
Right.
hanging on a wall in the store. And now you can practically get any form factor you want that you can cut screens to.
Yeah.
You can have, we can put screens on shelves, right? And we'll call them electronic shelf labels to give it a name, but it can still be part of the retail media network. So pretty much any shape, size, format you want to incorporate can be done. You just have to have the creativity to figure out what do you want it to do and what kind of content is it going to have? How do you
Right.
want it to be in front of customers?
And
So all those things are possible now.
that whole brand involvement, that is so, to me, exciting, because
Mhm.
it can be like self-sufficient in revenue then, if you're kind of having your brand partners kind of support your digital
Mhm.
signage
Yeah.
strategy.
Yeah.
In terms of what the consumer expects or wants, where do you see in terms of how digital signage is being, you know, expected or embraced, and or is it becoming that, they're not noticing it, maybe?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. So on the one hand, I tend to think that most consumers, when you go into a store, this is the kind of technology that in and of itself maybe up levels the feeling of the experience from in terms of what kind of environment are you walking into. So there's a different feel, right, if you walk into a luxury store versus a mass merchandise store and so on, right?
Right,
And I think when you add digital signage technology where you're doing something beyond just hanging screens, right?
right,
Then you are up leveling the feeling of the environment for the consumer. So it feels a little bit more luxurious because there's more technology to it. But at the same time, it is possible to overdo it.
right,
And I also think most consumers don't want to feel like the technology is being shoved in their face.
right,
They want the shopping experience to be front and center and the technology to support that and make it better. So the best solution, and I do think most retailers are still figuring this out in this in-store retail media environment. What is the appropriate mix and deployment that doesn't make a consumer feel like you're being bombarded with advertising? Because at the end of the day, this really is an advertising
right.
vehicle. But you don't want consumers to feel like they're in the middle of Minority Report and they're being bombarded with ads everywhere. It needs to be somewhat subtle and it needs to be somewhat seamless, and still feel like it's up leveling the feel of the shopping experience and still delivering value. Now, if you think about what kind of value do those consumers want, usually everyone kind of thinks, well, it's about price, right? It's about making people aware of a promotion, a sale, an offer.
Right.
And I think brands probably want it that way as well. But it's not just about the pricing. I mean, to a brand, they are going to view your media network as advertising at the point of sale, essentially. I mean, once you have that consumer in the store, there's some implied intent
Right.
that they're there looking for something. They want to discover something. And if I position ads for my product as the brand in front of them, whether I'm advertising a discount or a promo or not, I'm at least putting the product in front of them where they can see it and keep it top of mind. And if that maybe gives me an advantage over the next brand that's on the shelf, right? And that's a plus for the brand. And hopefully it's a positive for the consumer because it's helping them make a decision, helping them discover products. I think that needs to be seen as the goal rather than am I sending as many discounts as possible
Right.
in front of the consumer?
Yeah.
Because I don't
I think
necessarily think that's what they're expecting.
that product discovery point you made, I think that's critical.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think a consumer, wants to discover, but depending on how far they get into a store or when their mood is that day, you know, the opportunity to see something that they might not
Right.
or learn
Right.
about,
Yeah.
which I find engaging. I mean, when I
Yeah.
was in the city for NRF, and I was amazed on how much digital signage was outside at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And I was drawn to it because I'm
Yeah.
thinking, you're right, what is that?
Yeah.
Is that a map? Is that a new event? Whatever. And it's everything, obviously, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you look at, you know, downtown Manhattan, it's like everything.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and, we just did a little write up about the whole sphere in Vegas. And, to me, digital signage has gone, crazy. From your viewpoint, what have you seen? What would you say have been the biggest developments or the biggest innovation? And on the back end, what are the top one or two challenges still facing maybe the industry as a whole?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, to me, some of the milestones are a little subtle in that. I mean, definitely one thing that's made a big impact here is the evolution of the screen technology.
Right.
And along with that, it's not just the capability. As consumers, right? Consumers look at screens in terms of, well, what's the actual screen technology? Is it an OLED screen? Is it a mini LED?
Right.
And so on and so on, right? Which matters, of course, for digital signage too, based on where you're going to put it,
Right.
because the brightness is even more important in a digital signage commercial environment than it is in your home. But there's also a factor of reliability, especially the more intricate and creative you make the application of the screen form factor, the more reliable you really want it to be. Because if it's more complex than just a screen I hang on a wall, maintaining it, replacing and fixing it gets costly.
Right.
And we want those costs to be down. So I think that evolution of both the screen technology and the reliability that came with it, I think, is a major milestone that's made this easier, because cost was absolutely an impediment in the early years of digital signage.
Right.
That kept a lot of retailers from investing in this. So that's one milestone. And I think the concept around how we define retail media networks is probably the other milestone. I think in the absence of that, retailers struggled to define what the value was of putting digital signage in their stores. And there were exceptions to this. There was one retailer one time I worked with who had some great ideas around how they viewed putting screens in their store as educational because of the type of product they sold. There was so many different variations. They wanted to put their educational content on the screens to help customers make decisions on which product to buy.
Right. Okay.
And that's great. That was a great application. But I think the concept of how do I turn this cost, which when you think about all the different costs other than labor in the store, right, this tends to be a pretty significant one just because of the capital investment required. So the idea of retail media, I think, is the second major milestone that has an impact on digital signage, because now this becomes a revenue generating machine.
Right.
And that is the incentive, I think, for retailers to do it. And I think that's where we are right now, is people, retail organizations figuring out what's the right approach for my store, right, and for my brand to implement this in store. And if I have, if I'm a retailer with an e-commerce marketplace, maybe it's a little easier because I've probably already done this online. So now I'm just extending it to the store. If I'm not a marketplace, that it maybe is a little different in how you approach it. Because obviously, if you're a specialty retailer and you only sell your own products, then maybe there's a different approach to this, because you're not really looking for other brands to advertise their products since they're not in your store. Now, that said, I do think there's an opportunity for some brands to look at non-endemic advertisers to just in the same way that any TV channel has advertisers, right? Because you have an audience that's to some degree captive and is going to see this content. So if you can convince advertisers that you have enough traffic in your store that's worthwhile, even if it's a product that's not in the store, it could still be valuable for that brand's campaign. So I think that's where we are now, I think, in that milestone. So that's important.
And it's funny because that brings in all those other issues of making sure you align with the brand that you're concerned to support, right? So everything brings another bag of concerns and challenges. So given all you've seen, what do you think's going to be happening in 10, 15, 20 years? I mean, is it going to be more of the a form factor where you hardly even realize there's a screen? It's kind of like this amorphic signage coming around.
Yeah, I think there's two things that'll happen there. One is going to be the form factor. One thing, if I were to think of what have we not seen very much of in digital signage in stores, is transparent screens.
Right.
And I think that is going to change things, because today, if I want something that's not a square, rectangular type, geometric shape, there are certain form factors like that you can get made in a screen. But I view transparent screens as, well, I can kind of make any shape I want as long as the screen is positioned somewhere where, to the viewer, I don't notice that there's this transparent, glass border around it. I just see the content. So it almost makes it seem more realistic that way, if you do the content accordingly. So I think that's one thing that's going to be really change things in the environment and how you apply that content. And then I think the second thing is how we're going to see AI factor into retail media in this way, in multiple ways. One being, I think one of the main challenges today, for brands at least, is the measurement of all of this, especially in store. I think everyone has an understanding of how we measure this online, but how do you measure that someone actually saw your content on the screen in the store? And we'll start to see things like computer vision being applied and AI models that work on that to try to provide some meaningful measurement for brands for that. But then I think the next step from that is deciding what to put on the screen in real time based on what's happening in the store. I think that's what's going to make this more seamless and more valuable for consumers, because if you're the consumer and you're walking past a certain area in a store, how do we know that the content that's going to be displayed on this is meaningful to me versus the next person that walks by? And I think that's where we need things like computer vision, AI models, things to really learn and monitor what's happening in the store to be able to figure out what to put there. And I'm intentionally not using the word personalization here because that's where I think for a lot of consumers it gets a little creepy. If it's too personalized, but that doesn't mean it has to be personalized on you as an individual. But it's the kind of thing like, if you're in a department store, and I walk by a screen, it's probably less valuable if the content is going to show women's apparel versus men's
Right.
if I'm walking by the screen versus if
Right.
you walk by the screen. So the things like that, that's not necessarily hyper personalized, but it's correctly applicable, I guess I'll say.
You know what? To
Um,
me, it's like it's paying attention to what I'm looking for. So if I'm
mhm.
looking at a table of jeans, and I'm thinking, okay, what do I pair this with? And that screen
Yeah.
shows the latest turtleneck and the latest, you know,
Hmm.
shirt. Um, it kind of helps me say, okay, that's my look, and that's how
Right.
my style is. But on the other hand, it is a little bit like guesswork because you don't know me yet, but
Hmm.
the more you come, I think this whole idea of consumers coming into the store over and over and being able to kind of say, this is what Judy likes,
Hmm.
where she goes, she
Yeah.
goes right to the shoe rack first or whatever. You can build up such an engaging and honestly, right, personal experience
Hmm.
that doesn't get creepy in a way. It's
Yeah.
kind of like,
Yeah.
back in the day, we had store clerks who knew
Who
your,
did exactly that?
you know,
Right.
they're like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, we're
Yeah.
getting new sandals,
Yeah.
right? So it's
Yeah.
just taking that and putting it into the digital, realm. And
Hmm.
I find it very exciting. I mean, I
Yeah,
just,
yeah, and I think there's a huge opportunity here in particular for department stores,
right.
and I think department stores, if I'm honest, right, could use the help
Yes.
generally at the moment. But I think there's a huge opportunity here because the more varied mix of merchandise you have, as long as it's at least adjacently relevant in categories, and a department store, I think, is the perfect
Right.
example of this, right, with all the different apparel departments. Uh, there's a huge opportunity there, right, to leverage this to make that experience better and to create something that's unique that consumer is not going to get if they
Right.
go to a smaller specialty retailer that they could only get in this larger environment.
Yeah.
So I hope we see that happen. I think, in my mind, that's a huge opportunity for department stores.
Well, I'm really looking forward to having you back, in a year or two when we talk about where we were today
Hmm.
and what we're talking about in a year. And I really
Yeah.
appreciate you being here, Ricardo.
No, thank you. Thank you.
And again, to everyone, thanks for listening. Check out Ricardo's podcast and also check out Networld Media's group's YouTube channel where all our podcasts are there, and there's a bunch of great ones up there. Thanks again, Ricardo.
Thank you.